So we're going to get into the passage this morning quickly. I know a lot of you are already smelling some food, so I'm going to get through this really quickly, but I believe God's got a word for us this morning. We're going to come out of Exodus chapter 17. If you will, turn to your Bibles there on your phone or whatever you've got this morning. It'll be on the screen behind me as well. Let's read this. Then Amalek came and fought with Israel at Rephidim. So Moses said to Joshua, "Choose for us men and go and fight with Amalek. Tomorrow I will stand on the top of the hill with the staff of God in my hand." So Joshua did as Moses told him and fought with Amalek. While Moses and Aaron and Hur went to the top of the hill, whenever Moses held his hands up or held his hand, Israel prevailed. And whenever he lowered his hand, Amalek prevailed. But Moses' hands grew weary. So they took a stone and put it under him, and he sat on it. With Aaron and Hur held up his hands, one on one side and the other on the other side. So his hands were steady until the going down of the sun. And then Joshua overwhelmed Amalek and his people with the sword. So that's our passage this morning. It's a great backdrop and a great correlation to where we're going with this morning. But before I go any further, I want to give you some meat, some context to this, to kind of tell you where this story is in the canon story of Israel's people in the desert. We see that 3 chapters earlier before this, that Israel comes to the Red Sea with the Egyptian pursuers behind them. Moses does the same very act. He holds his hands up with the staff of God, and he parts the Red Sea. And the children of God go on to the other side. Egypt follows after them, and then God closes the water again and defeats the Egyptians that are going after them. So we see this happens only 3 short chapters before this story we just read. So it's not too long after Israel has already been freed from Egyptian bondage. And then we also see that just a little bit, actually right before this story, we see Moses' act of obedience of striking a rock to give water to the people that are grumbling. And you'll find that throughout the whole part of the 40 years in the desert, and even after the 40 years, after they got into the promised land, the Israelites had a knack for grumbling. And we see that Moses would deal with this by God's guidance and many other things. But then we see, not even too long after this story, that just as obedient as Moses was, we also see the human element of Moses being disobedient to God. We see in the exact same location where he struck the rock, that he goes back there in that same location again, and God says, "Speak to the rock." And Moses decides to do what worked last time and strike the rock, which cost him the ability to go into Canaan. That disobedience kept him from going into the promised land with his people. He led them to the cusp. Joshua took them the rest of the way. So we see this happening here. That's a little bit of backdrop for you this morning. I wanted to kind of give you an idea of where we're at within all this going on. We also see the provision of God through the manna and quail that God gave to the people. So he gave water here, and a little bit before this he gave quail and manna because they were grumbling again about being hungry. Because, that's the thing that we got to remember as a church. God's always provided. It may not be on your time, but God's always provided. And God always will provide. It's up to you to have the faith and patience to see it through. If Israel, I want you to grab a hold of this, if Israel would have just trusted, there would have been no need for grumbling because God would have provided if they would have just trusted. So we see a lot of this going on here, and we also see Joshua introduced for the first time in canon of the Bible. We see him introduced the first time here. We see him as a warrior person. We see him as an obedient person. Very obedient, but also very faithful. Very few of faithful people you'll find throughout this whole journey. But him and Caleb were one of the 2 spies that came back from the land of Canaan with a good report, while the rest of them had terrible reports. So we see Joshua introduced for the first time here, who would later succeed Moses as Israel's leader. So there's 2 things that I want to focus on before we move into our focal points, our 3 focal points. I want you to understand how we see Moses and how God's people saw Moses. There's a big emphasis on the study, on our word this morning, on Moses' hands and staff. There's 2 reasons why there was that much emphasis on that. I want to give them to you this morning. There's so much focus on his hands for these 2 reasons. 1, Moses is the one whom God chose to lead Israel. Number 1 is God chose chose Moses to lead Israel. And number 2, God was responsible for working the salvation of his people and this victory for his people through Moses. So God worked the deliverance through Moses because Moses was obedient. So it should be behind me. It may be worded a little bit differently, but God was responsible for working the deliverance of Israel through an obedient Moses, and God chose Moses. So those 2 things are very important because those are the 2 things the people of God noticed in Moses, in their leader, that it wasn't him, it was God. So 2 things there. So a great parallel for us this morning, and it's a great victory, the very first victory for God's people in their desert journey. We see that this is the first fight they come to, and it's actually their first victory that they have, and amongst many other ones that we see throughout the 40 years in the desert journey. So this morning, now with those things out of the way, I kind of, like I said, I wanted to paint a big grand picture for you of where we're at, where this story rests in. And now we're going to look at three things this morning. Number one, those around Moses identified a need. So they've seen a need. They feel the need, number two. And number three, they stay committed. And I'm going to hopefully show you that through these three things that all four men, Moses, Joshua, Aaron, and Hur, all four men stayed committed. They saw a need. They filled the need. And it was all four of them that worked together to make sure that this victory was possible for God's people. So those three things are what we're going to look at this morning and unpack. And through these, hopefully you'll see that this is how we honor our leaders. And we honor our leader that God has placed over us and moving forward with him into a victory for God and for God's people. So the first thing is this. Moses' ultimate trust in God, in the need that he saw, and filling that need with being the fight that they came to. So we see Moses' ultimate obedience yet again here. And then he orders Joshua to go fight. And he's like, okay, Joshua, you go fight. You go out there. You meet them head on. Meet Amalek head on and Rephidim. And you begin this fight. And for many times you'll look at that and be like, man, he told you to go fight. And now he's just going to go rest on the hill. But Moses knew that there was something else to the equation. And Joshua was just part of it. He knew that Joshua's obedience was part of this, and Moses knew his obedience was the other half of it. So we see that Joshua goes out and begins to fight. And at first, if I wouldn't have told you about, or reminded you rather, about him lifting his hands up above the Red Sea, and at parting, lifting your hands up above a battle with a staff in your hand may have seemed a little crazy. But if God can do it once with the Red Sea, he can do it again in a battle. But the key to that point is he needed somebody to be obedient to work through. And the Bible is littered with people who said, God, yes, I will be obedient. You just work through me. And we see Moses displaying this very well this morning. So we see that first, we see the need present itself. We see that Moses in this moment was doing what God told him to do, doing what God led him to do. He was feeling part of the need, but then a need presented itself that two men noticed and saw right away. They saw that there was a need to help their leader, and they didn't hesitate to do so. Oftentimes it's our willingness, and I want you to get this, oftentimes it's our willingness to be available and attentive to what we see around us and the needs around us. And when we're attentive to those needs, the doors of service will open and lives will change. So it's our willingness to see the needs and be attentive to the needs, and the service for those needs will open up and then lives will change. All because of our willingness to see what is around us, see past ourselves to Christ, with Christ's eyes to the needs around us. Put it on a Christ vision. So these two men noticed a pattern. They noticed a pattern. Every time Moses lifted his hands up, Joshua prevailed over Amalek. And every time he lowered his hands, being tired, they began to lose ground. Amalek began to overwhelm Joshua. So they noticed some pattern here. They noticed a pattern of a need that needed to be filled. And they said to themselves, okay, I see an opportunity here to do something. I see an opportunity to fill a need that will benefit not just my leader, but the entire people of Israel. These two men noticed that pattern. Aaron and Hur saw an opportunity to do something. They knew that Moses was placed in leadership by God, and God was working through him, because they noticed the way what represented with the hands that we talked about earlier. They noticed those two things. They knew Moses was placed there. They knew God was working through him. They understand that enabled them to identify that need and understand their place in that need. And that place was to say, hey, look, I can do something. I can do something. I see a need and I can do something, and I'm going to do something about it. They saw an opportunity, and with that opportunity came the understanding that by supporting Moses, I'm supporting God's people. By supporting Moses, I'm supporting the call of God on Moses to lead my people to the promised land. I have a part to play too. I have a place to do. I have something to do that I can do that will support the goal of God's people making it into the promised land. You see where I'm going this morning with this? I'm honoring God by willing to honor the man he installed over me. So the goal of Moses was not to gain power for himself, right? If you look at Moses' life, it wasn't for that, but to be obedient to God no matter the cost and to trust in him no matter what, to accomplish the promise that God had placed for his people. And with that, all glory be to God. Moses said, I'll be obedient. I'll do what you want me to do. I'll play my part. I'll be the position that you place me in. And all glory be to you, because I'm just the obedient vessel that you're working through. I want my people to see that your power works through me so that they'll trust in you the way I trust in you. This is where Moses was this morning. So, Life Point, where does this look for us? We see that these two men do this feel this need. They see this need, and I'm going to speak some life into something this morning because I've been really feeling very strongly about our YouTube channel and the opportunity that we have as a church to go not only outside of our walls in the community, but outside virtually as well. Because we live in a consumer world that consumes a ton of social media. And I won't be some of that social media that they're introducing into their lives be God. And one way we can do that. So I'm going to say this to the people that may be watching this one day, someday, however they may be, that you're sitting in a church some days too, and you just happen to come across this message. I'm saying this to them too. This happens to go to anybody in any church. This is for you too. I just feel very strongly that one day we're going to have an opportunity to speak life through what he speaks, or whoever speaks up here, to someone that lives hundreds of miles or thousands of miles away, simply because we recorded it and everybody shared it. Everything's part of ministry when you begin to look at it. So it means that being willing to see the need within the ministry that you're a part of, that God has placed a shepherd here to guide his people, the church that he has charged under him, and saying that I want to be a part of that. Because what you're seeing here is a grander picture to everything. I want to be obedient to the call that God's placed on my life as he's being obedient to the call that God's placed on his life. Active in it and growing God's kingdom. Because I see a God working within my pastor. I see a God working within him and a God that has chosen him to do and installed in him to do what he's doing here, to guide, to teach, and to grow. And sometimes, yes, it means to correct. Because God corrects us all the time because he loves us, right? And another sermon for another time. To lead us, he's led by Christ, and to bring God's glory to the world and bring glory to God's kingdom and to grow God's kingdom, not his own. That's a beautiful thing, church, when we see that. And trust me, it's a load off the pastor's back when you could say, hey, I'll band together and I'll fill the void too. I'll fill the void and I'll go forward. I'll fill the void with the talent that God's placed in me for this church to do. Because I love hearing stories, and I got to hear one not too long ago, where somebody made the decision that out of all the places they could be, they chose to be here. And they're still like, he hasn't completely showed me why yet, but I know I need to be here. Filling the void, filling their place within this, because every place that is filled is important. And we'll get into that in a minute. So we see that by speaking of filling needs and talking about needs, that's what Aaron and Hur did. They grabbed a stone and they put it up under Moses and said, hey, sit. And then as soon as they said that and did that, they grabbed a hand in each of their arms and they held it up until the battle was over with. They saw a need and they filled the need. They supported. Moses was able to accomplish what Moses set out to do, that God set him out to do, because other people came in and along with him and supported him through the process. Moses may have been called by God. Moses may have been installed as the leader over Israel and being obedient by allowing God to work through him. Moses may have been that person, but that did not stop Moses from getting tired. Moses was obedient and faithful in the capacity that God had ordained him to be in, but Moses was still a man with a human body. His spirit may have been willing to do all these things that God has set him out to do. He may have been obedient and faithful, but it didn't stop his body from getting tired. Moses was showing that, hey, look, I'm willing to do it even if I have to sit down for a second and stand back up again. I'm going to make sure this ends the way God had told me it's going to end. But it wasn't until two other men said, you know what? I'm a part of this people. I'm a part of Israel, and a victory for Israel means a victory for me. So if it's a victory for you, it means a victory for me. If it's a victory for me, it means a victory for you. When we work together for a victory of God, it's a victory for all God's people. So what we see is that these two men say, hey, I see this and I'm going to feel this so that what can come to pass in Moses that was set for Moses to do will come to pass, and my people will gain the victory that they were originally meant and intended to do. And guess what? I'll get to say I was a part of it because I feel the need. He was not designed to do it alone. The church was not meant to rest on the back of one man. It was not meant or designed to be carried forward and with a vision given to him solely for him to do all the work. We are a church together. We all play a role together. We all bind ourselves together in unity to move forward what Christ has given us. Aaron and Hur did not lose sight on what was important. They saw the grand scheme. They didn't lose sight. Oftentimes we're quick to lose sight of the grand scheme of things because we put ourselves first before we ever put God first. Because a selfish way of looking at things will always put your needs over someone else's when God's saying, I'll fill your need by you filling someone else's. And oftentimes, sometimes the need that you're feeling will fill the void and the gap that you've been longing for. And all it takes is some obedience and faithfulness on your part. So Aaron and Hur did not lose sight. In order for the battle to be won, they needed to support Moses. So we support the call on God that is placed on our pastor to spread the gospel to the lost by banding together, by pushing forward, by using our callings, our talents, and our gifts to push the gospel forward. We can see that through 22 years of obedience here in Americus. It wasn't for Pastor Bud to be known, but for the people to know Christ through his service that he does, that he imparts. When we see that, the big picture that is not about one person, but it's about a lot of people, but it takes one person's active obedience to get a lot of people together to push forward, because we've got to have a vision and we've got to have that leadership to move forward. Moses had to assume his role. Moses had to lead. Moses had to be obedient, and the people up under him had to see that obedience was not of himself but of God and band together behind him. So it's a group effort, right? Okay, group effort. So we see that. Church is a team effort, a together thing. This is not a pastor do it all thing because that's what he gets paid to do and we sit from the background and do nothing. That's not how we accomplish the vision of God. This is a unity thing because a unified church is a church on the move. I'll say it again because I don't think many of you got that. Unified church is a church on the move. You want to give you some correlation to that? Because there's one particular entity that is extremely unified and is extremely organized, and that's Satan. There's a story in the Bible, well, not a story rather, an actual historical point in the Bible where Jesus was accused of being Satan. Some of the teachers didn't quite like the fact that demons were being casted out, so they said, you must be Satan to cast out demons. And Jesus had this point to say. He said, why would Satan drive out Satan? A house divided against itself will fall. Jesus wasn't speaking to the church. Jesus was speaking about Satan and saying to them, hey, if Satan is against himself, then how does he ever expect to be any success at anything? So if our enemy is very unified and if our enemy is very organized, don't you think the church needs to be too? Don't you think the church needs to be unified in what they do? Don't you think the church needs to be together in what they do? Because I promise you, Satan has it together. He knows the buttons to push. He knows the things to do. He knows how to do it. He's been doing it for millennia now. And you see it constantly in everybody's lives, that you see that one thing that is just their tick that they always have an issue with. Just imagine if they had somebody that was a Christian that come and band together with them and say, hey, I'll take this journey with you. If Satan's unified, the church needs to be unified. Because he's not going to stop. Because he knows that there's nothing he can do to win the battle, but he can take some people with him. Hey, I may not be able to win this fight, God. You may be able to win. I get it. It's already written. It's already done. I'm going to lose. But if I'm going to lose, I'm going to take a lot of your precious children with me. And I'm going to fight to the bitter end no matter what it costs me to make sure that I take and show people Christ so that they can skip hell and go to heaven with me. Amen? A unified church is a church on the move. Paul says it best. I love how Paul says it. He talks about the church being a body and that Christ being the head of the church, and the body moves forward because Christ is the head. You know, we move forward as him in the forefront. Pastor's filling his role. He's part of the body, but he's filling the role that he's designed to do and God's called him to do. Now it's part of the church as us to fill our role and fill our part of the body and move it forward. Because as a church here, singular, if we do that, imagine what we can accomplish together when we all assume the roles within the body of Christ and we help move it forward. Imagine what we could accomplish. Imagine what the church as a whole could accomplish if we'd all band together and be apart and be unified. And I love how Paul uses that to display that, to show us this morning. We're all a part of it. We all have a role to play. We all have a place to be. We all have a talent and an opportunity to use that talent. When we feel that, the body moves forward. And yeah, the body will continue to move forward without you, but think about how much more harmonious it will move forward with you. When you just say, hey, my talent's the gift of gab. In other words, I can talk. That means I'm going to go talk to somebody in the parking lot. That means I'm going to go talk to somebody as they come in the door. And you know, as a first-time guest, I love hearing people say just how great our church is. That people will talk to them, that people will love on them, no matter they don't even know who they are. They met them 2 seconds ago. Feels like it's been family for 5 years. I love hearing that. Maybe your service to the church or maybe your talent is just simply being in the background and making sure things get done, making sure things are ordered in the way they should be. And there's nothing wrong with that. You know why? Because it's just as important. It serves its purpose within the body to move the body forward. There's many gifts of the Spirit. And the Spirit gives as He sees fit to each person. for a purpose because he sees what needs to be done and how it needs to be done. And you have a place and you have a void to fill. When we fill those voids, the church moves forward. For many of you in here, you're filling needs, and I appreciate it. I love seeing people fill needs. I love see people serving. I love seeing people use their talent for God. Because I was that one person not very many years ago, actually, who was like, I'm good with whatever. I don't really care. I'll just be in the background. I'm fine. Until I finally was like, you know what, God, this isn't working because I'm not doing what you called me to do. And nothing's ever satisfying me because I'm not allowing you to satisfy me. And I love seeing people allowing their talents and gifts to be used. And I love seeing it push the gospel forward. I love seeing it push the vision forward. Because to me, that shows a unified church. And when we're unified, we're moving. And when we're moving, we're changing lives. And when we're changing lives, that's one less person that skips hell and goes to heaven. So I want to say thank you, and I want to encourage you to keep pushing forward if you're one of those people. And if you're on the cusp of saying, hey, I think I'm ready to serve, just do it. You'll be surprised. That may be the very thing that pushes you into the blessing that you've been praying for. So speaking on filling needs and being committed and doing all this stuff and being committed, what Moses, Joshua, Aaron, and Hur did is they were committed to the end, and they made sure that they were committed to fill what they were in and intended to do right then. Joshua kept fighting. Even though that sometimes the battle turned, he kept fighting. He didn't stop. He didn't say, all right, guys, we're routed. We got to move. We got to go. Let's just run. Let's run to the hills and let's just regroup. He kept fighting even when the battle turned. Aaron and Hur stayed committed until the fight was over. Yeah, I bet you they had, you know how they tell you in weddings not to lock your knees or you pass out, because it'd be very embarrassing to be the guy in the wedding that passes out and ruins it for the bride and groom. But I'm pretty sure like they would probably have to change legs. They would probably have to move around and shift a little bit, but they stay committed even when it hurt. And you know, the other piece of that puzzle is not just them three, but the last man, which was Moses. Moses stayed committed no matter what. He said, if you help me or not, I'm going to stay committed. It may take a lot longer to get to the victory, but I'll stay committed. But it was when those two men said, okay, I'll fill that need, that the victory came. And Moses may have been the leader, but without those under his leadership assuming their positions and staying as committed as he was, the victory that was had may have turned out a little bit differently. The commitment of the leader is only a part of the equation. Moses needed the commitment of the people as well. I love the similarity to us this morning. It takes being committed to the call of God for all of us. Pastor's committed all day long, but that doesn't matter. He can be committed all day long, and he can continue to push and push and push, but it's not until he has people behind him that say, hey, I will assume my position. I will assume my position in this body, and I will move forward with you. Together, we will accomplish this victory for God's people. And when God's people does that, victory is always in sight. Amen? It takes us being committed and willing to see the vision of pointing people to abundant life to come to pass in the greatest way possible. Moses was committed to God. The people under him and his leadership were committed to God. Because of that, there was a victory for Israel. And we get to read about it and we get to celebrate it with them. The key to the commitment of Aaron and Hur and Joshua was that they recognized that God had placed him where he was, that Moses was placed where he was, and that God was working through Moses. But Moses had to be obedient. Moses had to be faithful. Two, he was a part of the equation. And Moses accepted that, and because he accepted it and God worked through him, the people of Israel was led all the way through the 40 years in the desert to the promised land. I want to make sure you understand this morning. The people of God in Israel did not follow Moses because of who Moses was, in the sense of the man he was. They didn't follow Moses just because Moses said so. They didn't follow Moses because Moses said, I'm the way, or I got the power, look what I can do. They followed Moses because they seen God's hand on him, and they also saw the obedience of him to God and what God did through his obedience. That's when they followed him, because they saw God working through him. They saw that God had placed him. Life Point, God has placed a great leader in our church. And I am thankful for that, because I'll tell you a little bit of my story. Because if he'd have gave up 10 years ago or 12 years ago, I don't know where I'd have been, because it took somebody. I know Christ gave me what I've got, but it took somebody else seeing it in me and helping me along the way to get there. And if he'd have gave up 12 years ago, where would I be? Would I have assumed my position? Would I be where I am? I know he's probably burning up with like red face right now. But I'm just telling you, sometimes it takes somebody saying, I'll be obedient, for the obedience of other people to be activated. And you'll be amazed that when you may be obedient in your family, what is activated throughout your family. But I'm thankful that I've had somebody that will say, hey, I see something, and I'm willing to help, I'm willing to push, I'm willing to prod, I'm willing to correct, and I'm willing to be there. I'm thankful for that. I'm thankful for that. So we have that placed here. And you see what God is doing in this church because of one man's active obedience on the call of God in his life and those that have decided to band around him. Now imagine this. I said those. Now imagine if we all assumed our positions, what we could do together for Christ. Together, him included. What we could do for Christ. The fulfillment that you may be seeking may be found in the service of others. And it may simply be saying, I'll serve, I'll do, I'll be part of it.
Hey everybody, this is Pastor Bud Womack from Life Point Church here in Americus, Georgia. I wanted to take this opportunity to thank you for joining us today in this worship experience. Our prayer is that the message you've heard is relevant for your life and for today, and also that it builds the body of Christ as a whole. We'd like for you to go to our YouTube channel, click on subscribe so that you can be a part of the next messages that come out. We'd also like to give you the opportunity to be a part of Life Point Church as we continue to point people to abundant life. If you'd like to give and help support this ministry, go to our website, www.lifepointamericus.com. Click on the Give button, and you'll be able to follow the steps to support this ministry.